Hello and welcome to Creswell's Educational Research, Chapter 13, Grounded Theory Designs. Give you a little bit of background. Grounded theory was developed by two sociologists, Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss, in the 1960s. Their combined work at the University of California with terminally ill patients led to the development and the foundation of grounded theory approach to research. Um, in this, they proposed a theory discovered during data collection, as founded in grounded theory, will fit the situation being researched and will work when put into better use than a theory identified before a study begins. So their development and continued work over and from the 1960s to roughly right around the 2000s, early 2000s, um, caused them to actually fundamentally start to divide, and a new developed theory where Strauss worked with Corbin developed. So the systematic uh, design is the one that Glaser and Strauss developed in that early 1960s, and evolving from their work and their consistent development, the emerging design of Strauss and Corbin came to light. An articulated philosophical positioning by Sharmazaz of created a third type of design called the constructivist design. So going forward from this and going through where grounded theory came from, we want to look now at the underpinnings and assumptions that are required to have a solid grounded theory research design. First, grounded theory is a qualitative procedure that relies on interviewing of people for this approach, observations, and other qualitative means of data collection that allow a conceptual level of this data to be worked with through this grounded process. We'll define this groundedness in a few slides, but the reality of it is that it's the ability for the research to study people's experience with a process, an action, or an interaction. And this allows then the researcher to analyze that data through a sequential series of steps to create a theory of how that process works from the actions or the explanations of the actions of people. One of the keys to grounded research is that the theory is generated only from the data that was collected from the study and no other sources. So grounded theory is really grounded in the data collected from the process and has no other outside influences or resources that are used. Researchers analyze one set of data and obtain direction from this analysis for the next set of data. Grounded theory provides a systematic step-by-step process that is recommended and easy to use for rookies, if you will, to the beginning researchers, because it keeps them closer to the data in all steps of this process. And that closeness or that proximity allows for the researcher to really ground their theory that is founded in the data because they've worked with it intimately throughout the entire process. So as new researcher, all of us are looking into coming in and doing our own research for our project. in our master's program, Creswell offers that there's an important question, and that is when to use grounded theory over other forms of research. So he outlines that grounded theory should be used when the researcher or the research itself requires a broad theory or explanation of a process, or an explanation of people's actions. So that being said, it's definitely not a microscopic look at the data, at development for the theory, and the data component that we'll talk about in a little bit is the microscopic and the really working with it to develop categories. But the research question itself, as a study, is looking at a broad or a brushstroke approach, a broad view of the study of a process and the actions of people, to ground yourself in a theory to explain those actions of that process. So an example that was on page 433 in chapter 13, what is the process involved in apprehending students for weapon possession in a specific high school? So we have the specificity of looking at one high school and having the ability to use grounded theory to look at the apprehension of a large, broad group of students, where it's a set of individuals, and this specific researcher looked at staff interviews and also apprehended students who were carrying weapons or in possession of weapons, and getting those perspectives. So Creswell says that this type of a research question is advantageous to use grounded theory. So although there's three designs, the systematic, the emerging, and the constructivist, for grounded theory, they all have 5 key characteristics to them. So whichever you're going to use or your research lends itself to, they share this common set of characteristics. The first being that grounded theory is a process approach. The researcher is charged to examine a process, and because of the social nature of our interactions with other people, the researcher is able to then analyze these interactions through interviews and observations, and possibly some other means that weren't necessarily further discussed in the chapter. But their ability to take these interactions and categorize them into broad ideas presented from this data allows, or is that first characteristic, that it is focused on that process. The second is that the researcher's ability to choose the forms of data and how it will be collected, and gearing itself towards yielding text and images useful to generating a final theory. This is theoretical sampling, the conducting of interviews and the structuring of it that we learned early on in our course. The third is a constant comparative data analysis, and by this, Creswell outlines grounded theory charges the researcher and has the expectation to engage in the process of gathering the data, sorting it into categories, collecting and interpreting possible additional information, and then able to compare it to new information once it is old and it's being reanalyzed, and really putting that towards focusing to the fourth step, which is by this process and this natural weeding out of misconception or error that could be incurred through a single evaluation, this constant evaluation of the data allows for the researcher to generate a theory, or sorry, to generate a core category. This core category relies heavily on the generation, or is relied heavily on for the generation of a final theory by using grounded theory for the researcher. This core category identification and coming to a theory is reliant on using memos, and memos are short or long notes that help explain a researcher's analysis of categories and how they reached their theory or generated their theory in the end. So now we covered the key characteristics. Really the data collection and analysis, that constant churning, if you will, of looking at those categories and narrowing them down and putting them into broad groups allows for us to now go into that step-by-step systematic approach. And I think it's important to understand that although there's 3 types of grounded theory, the systematic design is the most prevalent in literature. The emerging and the constructivist design are not as user-friendly, as Creswell points out, and the frequency of the use is why he recommends it for the beginning researcher. So I think it's important that we understand the systematic approach and its 3 main coding steps. So these 3 steps are the open, the axial, and the selective coding phases. So in open coding, the researcher sets up those initial categories for their topic of research. All the categories are based solely on the data that was collected through the interviews and the observations. So there's the touching base of those memos, as we mentioned just prior to now, and it's really the first phase of sorting through all of the data. So now that we have initial categories, the axial coding phase, the researcher then goes and selects one open coding category as the core and starts to relate all other categories to that core category that has the most evidence that it would be that core because the researcher has gone through it. In the selective coding phase, the researcher establishes the theory now because they've worked with the data, they've established a core from the categories, related them all to it, looked at the interrelationships that exist, and come to a theory. So there's 8 steps to systematic approach to grounded theory. First step is simply to decide if grounded theory is right for your research topic or field, or question. The second is you need to decide on the process that you wish to study. So what group of people, how are you going to do that? Again, it's still a qualitative research methodology, and so all of our rules for qualitative research apply. Going further to that, it's that broad look at identifying a process, a group of people to study to develop that theory. So third, Like any research, it's crucial to seek approval and access permission to conduct the research from participants or really anybody involved or impacted or could be impacted by your research design. The fourth is the theoretical sampling, conducting the research, doing the interview, having everything in your design set, and then taking the time to do the qualitative data collection. The fifth is to now take that data and run it through open axial and selective coding. So code the data. 6 is to finish the selective coding phase and develop a theory. In grounded theory, validation of your theory is a must prior to generating a research report. And so that validation includes taking your newly developed theory and comparing it to other research and literature. So the writing of the grounded theory research report is a little bit different. It's definitely more scientific and includes a problem heading, a method heading, a discussion heading, and a results. It's much more third person and objective in tone. And when we outline the process in and of itself, and we have to have the ability to evaluate the quality of a grounded theory study. So I thought it would be necessary to have a quick link in a sense to what the theory, if it's developed through grounded research or through grounded theory research, it must be to be high quality. So grounded theory research must be grounded in the views of the participants. It has to develop a theory from linking of concepts and categories, running through, if it's a systematic approach, the open, the axial, moving into that selective and developing a theory. It must use one of the systematic, emerging, or constructivist approaches. It has to strongly link the researcher memos when working through that data and recategorizing and picking a core. And the theory has to have a presentation or be presented in a visual way so that it can be relatable to other research and other literature, and so that the researcher as audience can quickly understand where that theory was developed from. So like any research, there may be some red flags. Some of those red flags outlined by Criswell in chapter 13 are two qualitative, broad qualitative ethical issues that arise. But he does make mention that there are not many because of the self-correcting model of grounded theory. Looking at that data, working with it, recategorizing, it naturally weeds out some of those misconceptions and some of that inherent error that can come from other qualitative or quantitative research designs. The two that still remain is the categorization is done by a single researcher, and therefore that single researcher's ability to be subjective or objective and have the tendency to advance the purpose of the study and have that power and authority in that interview is not free from grounded theory design. The ones that are unique to ethical issues that are unique to grounded theory are that the researcher's ability to build a useful chain of evidence from data that is gathered, specifically in the transition from the open to the axial phase, is going to be a possible downfall, I guess, or a limitation. And if that's not obtained, then generating a beneficial theory for those the study is intended to serve is also inherent and a possible limitation of grounded theory. Well, I thank you for joining me here in Chapter 13 of Creswell's Educational Research, Grounded Theory Designs.